Okay, today's chapter has a little bit of resolving. Will Charles muster up the courage to propose to Sarah? What will Sarah's response be? How will she handle that? And how will Charles handle whatever her response is? How will Will being gone for a month affect any of this? Time to find out. So let's get started. Chapter 6. Charles prepared for his encounter with Sarah with the utmost care. Though he had shaved and bathed the night before, he repeated the operation, heating water on the tiny stove in numerous pans and buckets. He polished his riding boots with mutton tallow, and finally, to complete his appearance to his own satisfaction, he sought a barber and instructed him to give him the best dang haircut you've ever given a man. Still not satisfied, he wandered up and down Main Street, wondering what appropriate gift he could take to Sarah that would exactly suit her. Suddenly, he caught sight of a window displaying beads, earrings, and other jewelry. He read the sign above the door, Boyd Park Jeweler. He entered and asked to see what gifts they had for sale. "For a lady?" asked the little man in charge. "Yes, and it must be just right." "How about a necklace?" "No." "Let me see those rings in that tray." "Ah, yes, these are lovely, and the only rings in Salt Lake City at present. They came from New York," exclaimed the clerk proudly. Charles looked at them carefully, one by one, trying each on his little finger for size, then replacing it, not quite satisfied. The clerk's face became more and more anxious as he saw one after another of the rings rejected. "This is all you have?" asked Charles as he laid down the last one beside the others. "Yes, sir. All except a pair set with opals. One for a man and the other for a lady. They are very lovely, yet expensive. I think they have quite a history, but I'm not familiar with it. Mr. Park isn't here just now, but he has them in the safe. Can't you get them out and show them to me?" "I suppose I could, sir, but I'm interested and may wish to purchase them if they please me." "They are very expensive, sir, and must be sold for cash only." Charles was becoming impatient, and he drew his buckskin wallet from his pocket and opened it under the little man's nose. A number of bright shining gold pieces glistened within. "I can pay for what I buy," he exclaimed recklessly. He had not intended being over-extravagant when he entered the shop, but all unknowingly the clerk had excited in him that mania for the possession of the hard-to-get or the impossible, so that now he was determined to buy the rings, both of them, if he liked them. He waited while the clerk tinkered with the small safe in the far corner of the aisle behind the counter. Presently he returned with an exquisite wine-colored plush case, such as Charles had seen only in England. His heart missed a beat as he pressed the tiny pearl catch, and the lid flew open to reveal two shimmering, perfectly matched opal rings set side by side on a cream satin lining. He lifted the heavier ring gently out of the case and tried it on his left finger. It slipped into place as though it were molded for him alone. He held his hand up, as vain as a girl, to admire the dancing lights cast from the rainbow depths, drinking in its beauty with a hitherto unknown satisfaction. Finally, he drew the ring from his finger and replaced it in the case, taking up its mate and trying it on his little finger. It would not quite slip over the second knuckle. He could get it on by forcing it, so he was satisfied that it would fit Sarah's left hand as perfectly as the larger band fit his own. "How much?" he asked. $115, sir, for the pair. "But I'll take them." And Charles emptied his wallet onto the counter and began counting out the gold pieces. He had only 2 $5 coins left after paying for the rings, but he pushed the money toward the clerk without batting an eye, picked up the case and walked out onto the sidewalk. Proud and satisfied to the very depth of his being with his purchase, he turned his steps towards Sarah's home. As he walked, his heart beat high with hope. All his old self-assurance returned, and he felt sure of victory. It was not quite noon when he left the jewelry shop. The sky overhead was filled with high, fluffy white clouds. They clung to the mountain tops like steam from a huge engine, making a wide, cottony border all along the eastern horizon. The sun seemed to clear a path for itself through their soft depths, only once in a while remaining hidden for a moment behind an extra-large cloud, too dense for its rays to filter through. Charles walked with his head held high. His handsome brown face was relaxed and pleasant to look at. About his lips, a faint hint of a smile flickered. Now and then his hand sought the inner breast pocket of his open leather jacket. His fingers caressed the plush covering of the jewel case with a sense of keen anticipation welled up almost to overflowing within him. Some thought struck him suddenly, and he stopped under a towering poplar tree beside the road. He withdrew the case and opened it. Taking the larger of the 2 rings out, he slipped it into his trouser pocket. He closed the lid over the remaining ring and returned the case to his inner pocket and proceeded on his way. The front door of the cottage was open as he came up the path. Sarah was dusting the cups on the shelf above the fireplace, humming softly to herself when he stepped in the open doorway. As his shadow fell across the room, she looked up, startled to find him there. He hooked his thumb into his belt and leaned slightly against the doorframe, drinking in the sight of her with his devouring gaze. "Hello, Tulip," he said. "Did anyone ever tell you how beautiful you are in a dust cap, with that wicked hair of yours escaping from under it?" Then he was beside her, with one arm about her waist, while the other swept the cap from her head and stood holding her gently, expectantly, all the love, all the hope in his being, glowing in his burning, intent countenance. She seemed to grow smaller in his embrace. All the breath left her body as she shrank back against his arm, seeking to escape the kiss she knew was coming. But she looked straight back into his eyes without faltering, holding back his lips with her eyes alone. Because of the expression he read in her face, he paused without taking the kiss. He straightened up slowly, still with one arm about her, and said, "Come over here on the sofa and sit down. I have something for you." Too amazed by his strange new behavior to resist, she allowed herself to be led across the room and sat down beside him on the cot. He reached into his pocket with his free hand and set the jewel case in her lap. She sat staring at it helplessly. "Open it, honey. It's for you." But she made no move to his bidding, so he picked it up and opened it himself. Before she realized his intention, he captured her hand and slipped the ring over her left third finger. "Oh, Charles!" It was the first word she had spoken since his arrival. There was both surprise and protest in her exclamation. She looked at him again. To her, he seemed like a warrior armed for battle. The ring was his weapon. To refuse it would be to disarm him. He was at his best at this moment. She knew it, and was touched by it. For the first time she saw him as she knew Will always did, and dreaded to strike the blow she knew she must strike. In a flash, she realized that she brought out the best as well as the worst in this man by her response, or lack of it, to his wooing. Before she could find words to protest, he began to speak again. He kept his arm across her shoulders, but did not try to force his caress upon her. Instead, he forced himself to restraint. This was the showdown, and he knew it. If he lost control or got angry now, he'd lose the battle. He was determined not to let her slip through his fingers, but to win a promise from her that would be binding. He'd use every means in his power to attain his end, for without her, his life would be worthless. "Before you say anything, will you listen to me for a moment, Sarah?" He held her hand with the ring in his. She turned her face away and was silent. He continued, "Darling, the first time I saw you, I fell in love with you. I didn't want to, and I tried to put you out of my thoughts. But you know as well as I how we were attracted to each other. I've been a fool in lots of ways, and I haven't always treated you with the respect I should. I've scoffed at your faith and made fun of the Mormons in general. But I'm a changed man, Sarah. I've made up my mind to be what you want me to be. If you want me to join your church, honey, I'll join. I want to do it your way, and from now on, what you say goes." As he pled with her, he was amazed at the sincerity of his own words. He actually believed what he was saying. The words seemed to spring from a depth of his soul. She, too, was seeing deeper into him than ever before. With each new sentence he uttered, her task of telling him the truth, that she loved his brother and could never be his, became increasingly more difficult. Yet tell him she must. She turned toward him. Her eyes fell on the opal, shimmering like a living drop of captured moonbeams at the light played over it. Never in all her life had she seen one half so lovely. She had a passion for jewelry. Martha had once said, "There must be some gypsy in Sarah somewhere. She is so fond of gems and bright colors." She had never possessed any jewelry except her earrings, but she loved them and wore them proudly. As a queen, her crown. She was fascinated by the beauty of the stone on her finger, yet strangely enough, it created in her no desire to own it. This, she knew, arose from the fact that she wanted nothing that would place her under the slightest obligation to this man. Had he offered her a crown laden with priceless jewels, she would have rejected it. Oddly enough, the thought passed through her mind, "I would sooner have a horseshoe ring from Will than this." How could she phrase her refusal so that it would be less painful, she wondered. As she hesitated for words, Charles spoke again. "I can make you so happy, sweetheart. We'll get a place of our own and settle here near your folks. Let's get married right away. If I join the church, your folks can't have any serious objections. Where's your mother? I'll speak to her right." She caught him by the arm as he made to rise. "Charles," she gasped, "you must not." Her hand sought her lips in the old familiar gesture she had when deeply perturbed. "You must listen to me, Charles," she went on, her eyes on his face. She was struck anew by the strong resemblance of the two brothers. He was more like Will at this moment than he had ever been. Gone was his reckless air of mockery and devil-may-care attitude. He was all seriousness and sincerity, while the new humbleness in his manner strengthened the likeness. "I hate to hurt you, for I like you so very much. Once I thought I loved you, and I told you so. Then I met Will. Now I know it is Will whom I love, Charles, with all my heart." She watched the light fade from his eyes. Slowly a curtain of blue smoke rose from their depth to hide the pain. His half-drawn breath stopped, suspended like a clock that suddenly stops ticking because the spring is wound too tightly and something snaps within. There was not a sign of color left in his face. It was set and gray. "So?" came from him at last, in a strange half-whisper. The cords in his throat seemed paralyzed, so that the words could not come through without great difficulty. "I am betrayed by the two I held most dear." "Dang him!" he added bitterly. "You are cruelly unjust, Charles, to blame Will," exclaimed Sarah. "It is I who am to blame. He made no advances to me. He thought of you." As she spoke, she drew the ring from her finger and replaced it in the case which still lay in her lap. "It's a beautiful ring, Charles," she said, laying the case in his hand. "Some day you'll find the right girl, one who will be worthy and proud to wear it." His fingers closed over the box as he rose slowly to his feet. He stood for a moment looking down at her, and she never forgot the expression on his face, nor his words. "You'll wear it yet, by God." And he turned on his heel and walked from the room. For hours after he left Sarah, Charles walked. He avoided the city itself, taking instead the road that led southwest, out toward the Jordan River. On and on he went. Leaving the road finally, he followed the river bank itself until he could see where the river emptied into the Great Salt Lake. He stood there a long time, looking out over the glittering surface of the salt water. His eyes narrowed to slits against the sun's mirrored reflection on the diamond-bright brine. His feet were hot and blistered, and he had come several miles, and the going had been anything but easy. After all, he was a horseman, and walking was out of his line. The muscles in the calves of his legs and above his knees ached with the exertion he had forced upon them, but he was unmindful of the discomfort. The island seemed just as far away here as it had done from the mountain road view, though it made the lake seem smaller somehow. Not so very deep, perhaps not over a man's head, he wondered. If it were the good, clean ocean, he muttered between set jaws, I'd walk out into it and forget the whole gosh dang mess. But who in heck wants to be pickled into a shallow salt pond, as though he were unable to swim, a mere infant, leaving his body to float like a cork afterward on the salty surface? Too dang cowardly anyway. Oh, dang them both. Presently, he took the ring case once more from his pocket. His head seemed almost to rest on his shoulders, with no neck to support it. As he stood there meditating, his locked jaws thrust savagely forward. He wondered if he could throw the thing far enough out that it would reach the shimmering water. He raised his arm, then let it sink back to his side. Again he saw the ring as it rested those few brief moments on Sarah's finger, where he had placed it. No, he could not destroy it. After all, it would not ease the death wound in his heart. Nothing he could do would banish his agony. He felt as though he were in a trance or dream. He was falling from a great distance. In other dreams, he had always awakened before he hit the ground, but this was different. The ground itself rushed up to meet him, even as his body rushed toward it. The force of the impact was so great that it tore the inward mechanism loose from his body, while it gave him a sinking feeling as though the earth under his feet was unsteady and insecure. His head felt light and dizzy, his forehead damp, hands clammy, though he did not actually lose consciousness. His strength ebbed from him because of the invisible injuries inside, sapping his bloodstream, his energy, his very life. The afternoon sun beat relentlessly down upon his bare head. He had eaten nothing since the day before. A black filmy curtain dropped without warning before his eyes, and he sank down on the hot, dry weeds and pebbles at his feet. Whether he had actually fainted or slept, he did not bother to ascertain when he again opened his eyes. But it was twilight. The sun had just dropped below the tip of the island. The water around it and the sky directly above where it had set were still reflecting its hidden glory. Both were drenched in multiple hues of rich red, purple, and gold, so exquisitely blended that they defied reproduction. Charles staggered to his feet, numb with misery and weariness. Slowly he began to retrace his steps toward the city. Hours later he stumbled into their darkened cottage, and not bothering to strike a light or remove his clothing, he dropped utterly exhausted onto his cot. When he awoke the following day, he found himself alone in the house. He arose stiffly and went to the door. The sun was high in the heavens. It was noon or after. He took his watch from his pocket and looked at it, but it had stopped, for he had neglected to wind it. It said 20 minutes past 3. He set it mechanically, and set it at 12:15, guessing at the time. He turned back into the bare, quiet room. There was a table, 3 cots, 2 chairs, and several boxes containing unpacked belongings of the 3 brothers, arranged here and there on the floor. The place was not dirty, but it did not look lived in. It gave one a deserted, left-behind impression. There was nothing homey, inviting, or comfortable about it. No curtains or dainty dishes. The men used it only as sleeping quarters, going out for meals since Mary Alice was not at home, to steer them in the preparation of their own food. All of their mother's belongings and part of Mary Alice's were still in the covered wagon. They had not unpacked them. He sat down heavily in the chair near the table. He hitched it closer and leaned both elbows on the board top, resting his chin between his cupped hands in meditation. He must face it. Sarah had rejected him. The hateful thought tore its way through his mind. He had built up such hopes, finally been so sure of success. Then, instead of his making her see his point of view, she had made him see hers. Not willingly, to be sure, but he knew the depth of her was defeated by it. Defeated, but not reconciled. Time itself could never change that. The hot July sun beating on the low roof made the room unbearably warm. His hair and forehead felt damp against his fingers. Leaning back in his chair, he removed his jacket, which until that moment he had forgotten to take off. As he pulled his arm from the sleeve, the jewel case fell out of the breast pocket onto the floor. Without leaving his chair, he leaned down and picked it up. He held it for a moment, then deliberately opened it and set it on the table before him. Was it his imagination, or did the stone seem paler? He remembered the gorgeous blending of pink into green, the green fading into yellow and blue, as it shone on Sarah's finger yesterday, like a tiny sunset on a cloudy day, caught and distilled there in the oval polished depths of the stone. Now it seemed as if the lights and colors had faded almost completely. Strange! What was it they said about opals? Something he had heard. Some superstition knocked at his memory. An opal must be worn by its owner to give off its richest radiance. Yes, that was it. But there was more. Opals were supposed to be extremely good luck to some, while to others they proved to be the direct opposite. If the owner were ill, the jewel became dull and lifeless. But when he or she were in robust health, the stone reflected richer, deeper colorings that seemed possible, but all that was wrought, mere superstition. Still, why not? He thought of his parting words to Sarah, then only an empty threat. A broken gesture, more like a curse. Suppose he were able to make them come true. Would the thing, the ring itself, have any effect upon her life? Would it be for good or evil? "I'll do it!" he exclaimed, half aloud. "Why not?" He hurried across the room to the box containing his personal belongings, and took from it paper, envelope, and pencil. Returning to the table, he wrote the following note. "Will, you win. I'm not staying to see the payoff, but here's a wedding gift for you both. I hope it brings you luck. Charles." He wrapped the note carefully about the ring, wrote Will's name on the envelope, inserted the tiny packet into it, and sealed down the flap. There, that'll do it. She'll wear it now, whether she wants to or not. Dang her. And here's hoping it does bring them luck. And I don't give a dang which kind. He felt slightly relieved somehow after that. Presently he drew the other ring from his pocket, where he had placed it the day before, and without trying it on, he put it into the empty case, snapped it shut, and carried it to his box. He lifted books, papers, and a small dagger and several other things out, and hid the case far down in the corner of the box, replacing the books, etc. Lastly, he folded his leather jacket and laid it across the top of the box. Just as he finished, Phil came in, carrying a loaf of homemade bread and a bottle of milk. The bread was still warm from the oven. And gave off a rich, delicious odor that penetrated throughout the room. "Where have you been?" asked Charles, through his tousled hair, and sniffing the crusty odor of the bread. "Over to Mrs. Moore's, cutting wood and mending her fence. She gave me this new bread, and I bought the milk from her neighbor. Mrs. Moore also gave me some green onions. She said if we're smart, we'd fix our own meals and save over half of what we spend eating out. Hungry? Yes, come to think of it, I'm starved." They sat down together and devoured the entire loaf of bread, cutting it in half, each slicing his own from the divided parts. They poured the milk into tin cups and broke the bread into it. Both ate hungrily. There was not a crumb or a drop of milk left, to say nothing of the green onions when they were finished. Charles was the first to leave the table. He got up and set his chair close in, with its back almost touching the edge of the board. He walked over to his cot and began smoothing the rumpled covers. He spoke with his back to Phil, trying to make his voice sound casual. "I'm leaving in the morning. Want to come along?" "Leaving?" exclaimed Phil. "Where are you going? What will Sarah think?" "I imagine she'll manage." He could not keep the bitterness nor the resentment from his tone. "But I thought," began Phil, also rising and dusting the crumbs from his mouth with the back of his hand. "You thought wrong. It's all off between us. I'm getting out of this place. I thought you might like to come along. After all, what is there here for a man? I like it here. I'm going to stay. They're calling for volunteers for the Utah Territorial Militia. I'm thinking of joining up." "You fool! Keep out of their militia. Let them fight their own battles. I'm going to join the church too. Already I've applied for baptism. You? But he stopped. After all, what could he say? Only a few hours ago he was saying the same thing to Sarah. And wonder of wonder, believing it. What kind of hypocrite was he becoming? That's what loving a woman did to a man. Made dang fools out of them. No woman on earth was worth it. He was through with the miserable creatures for all time. Tear a man's heart out without batting an eye. Fickle fools. Pretending to love a man one day and tossing him aside the next for someone else. He was well rid of her. Ah, yes. It was no use. He was starving for the sight of her, the touch of her supple, enchanting loveliness, her shining, abundant hair, and defiant blue eyes. Gosh, how was he going to live without her? Phil took some water and began washing the tin cups. He brushed the crumbs and green onions off the table with one hand into the other, cupped close to the edge to receive them. Walking to the open door, he threw them out onto the ground. As he turned back into the room, he glanced at his brother, now seated on his cot, leaning forward with his hands pressed together and hanging between his knees. "Where are you going?" He, too, tried to sound unconcerned, but one good look at Charles told him, in a measure at least, of the other's torment. He wished he might say something comforting and cheering. Then finally Phil said, "Aren't you going to see Mary Alice before you go?" "Yes, I suppose I should." Rubbing his hand over his chin, he continued, "Is there not any hot water on the stove?" "No, but it won't take long to heat some. I can kindle a fire in a second." "Never mind. Don't bother. I shaved yesterday. I'll go as I am. Why don't you take off your boots and change your shirt? It's really quite wrinkled." "I'll shine your boots while you rest. You could wait till evening to go over there." Charles was embarrassed by his brother's kindness and show of sympathy. It made him think of his mother and how she'd always tried to make things easy and bearable for him when the going was tough. A lump rose in his throat so that he would not trust himself to speak. Instead, he silently bent and began tugging at his dusty riding boots, drawing them off slowly, for now that he remembered his feet, they were sore and blistered, even swollen. It hurt to get the boots off. "Thanks," he said finally, sliding the heavy boots across the floor to Phil. "I think I will rest a while longer. Then we'll both go over if you like." He swung his legs onto the cot and lay back, with his hands cupped behind his head, relaxing full length. He wiggled his aching toes and feet in luxurious enjoyment, feeling the tired muscles relax as the air sifted through the thin woolen socks. "My, that feels good," he said, presently. Phil tiptoed about, finding the shoe rags and tallow, making as little noise as possible. Then he sat down in the far corner of the room under the north window and began to clean the dust from his brother's boots. When he glanced up, some minutes later, Charles was sound asleep. He had turned on his side, with his face toward the wall, and was breathing deeply and evenly. It was after dark when the two presented themselves at the widow's cottage. She welcomed them. Mary Alice, still very weak, had just gone to bed. But she wasn't asleep, so Charles went in and sat beside her bed. Phil stayed in the kitchen and talked to Mrs. Moore. The door between the two rooms was left open, so that there was enough light from the kitchen lamp for the bedroom, too. Charles picked up his sister's thin, delicate hand and held it in his long, slender brown fingers. "Still pretty thin, aren't you, sis?" "Oh, I'm ever so much better. Mrs. Moore is so good to me." "Like it here, do you?" "Very much. I'm going to learn to be a nurse when I get a little stronger." "You'll never be strong enough for that kind of work." "It's what I want to do, and it isn't really any harder than anything else. Sarah wants to learn too. She came to see me today. We talked about it. Mrs. Moore has books and everything. She's going to teach us." At the mention of Sarah's name, his hand tightened over her fingers. She looked up at him in surprise and then continued, "She asked where Will was. Did you tell her?" "Yes, I told her he had gone to Provo and would be gone a month. That's what he told me to say when he came to say goodbye." "What did she say then?" "Nothing, only she seemed disappointed somehow. By the way, when are you and she going to be married?" "We aren't. That's what I came to tell you. She has thrown me over for Will. I'm leaving town in the morning. I came to tell you goodbye and ask you to do me a favor." "Oh, Charles!" She reached out with her other hand and caressed his cheek in sudden sympathy. I'm so sorry. Don't talk about it. There's nothing to be done. He felt in his pocket and brought out the envelope with Will's name on it. Here, I want you to keep this and give it to Will when he comes back. Take good care of it. Charles opened his wallet and took out one of the 2 remaining gold coins. Here's a little something for you, he added, slipping it under her pillow. Where are you going? Will you be gone long? I'm not sure where I'll go yet, but I'm sick of this place. You know me. I've wandered around a long time now. Can't tell where I'll end up. He didn't stay long after that. He and Phil left early and returned to their room, where Charles packed what he wanted to take with him in 2 saddlebags, ready for an early start on the morrow. And that's it for today's reading. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Were you at all surprised in how Charles is handling this rejection? Do you think he'll be able to get over it and truly move on? Do you think he'll change his mind? The next chapter focuses more on Will and Sarah. I'd love to hear what you're hoping and expecting with those 2. And what are your thoughts about everyone joining the church in Charles's family? Everyone except Charles. Hope you enjoyed today's chapter, and I will see you next week for chapter 7.